Aoife was still a young woman, married but 2 years when her husband took an injury that turned septic. It turned to septicemia and carried him off to an early grave. And Aoife was so sad of heart and lost and afraid and bewildered that she took herself off to the woods not a week after the funeral, with every intention of hanging herself from a tree. And though she knew it was a sin and suicide would condemn her to hell, nonetheless she was so heartbroken, so bereft, she'd lost all reason. Deeper and deeper into the woods she went, until at length she came to a great old oak tree, with good thick strong branches, strong enough she thought to hang herself from, to do the job. And if anyone never found her body, well, so much the better for it, she thought to herself, for such was the state of grief she was in at the time. And she'd clambered up into the branches and tied one end of the rope to the branch and formed the other end into a noose, and was about to put it over her neck and jump, when a howling set up in the forest, the howling of wolves, and it sent a great shiver up her spine. And although she was intent on ending it all there and then, well, just the sheer intensity of the noise and the closeness of it, and the fact that barely had one howl faded away when another started up, and the next closer, and the next closer, and the next closer still, such that it felt as if the wolves must be circling around the very base of the tree in whose branches she sat. Well, it was enough to take her mind, at least temporarily, off the grim fate she had for herself. And looking down, she did indeed see grey shapes moving about in the forest. And she was going to end it all. If the wolves tore down her body and ate it afterwards, well, what care was that of hers? "What is it that you do?" said a deep, gruff voice, startling Aoife to a point where she very nearly fell out of the tree. And looking down, she saw a veritable giant of a man, a great, broad, burly man, swathed in hood and cloak, and that fur-lined and fur-trimmed, and about his feet, moving like fish through water, were the figures of wolves. And this man, with eyes that glinted like mirrors in the moonlight, stared up at her. "What is it that you do?" he said again. And shaken, fearful, for she had never seen him at all in her village, and she knew everyone very, very well, and indeed knew people from the other surrounding villages, and she had never clapped eyes upon this man in her life. She said to him, "My husband is dead. My parents are long since dead. There is nothing for me left in this world. Nothing. It is all over for me." And in that instant she put the noose around her neck and jumped from the branch. And if she'd expected him to just stand there and watch, well, she was in for a surprise. For the rope had not even pulled tight around her neck when it was severed, and she fell heavily into the arms of the man, that great burly giant of a man, who lowered her gently to the ground. And there she was shaking and shivering and looking up at him. And it was hard to get a sense of his face because his hood was pulled down, and the evening was full on, near into darkness already. He said, "You must stay here." But she said, "The wolves, what of the wolves? We will be eaten." And the man laughed and said, "The wolves will not eat you. Far from it, for the night is chill, and they will keep you warm till morning." And he lay down against the base of the tree and held Aoife in his arms, and the wolves, exactly as he said, circled around and around, and like dogs nestling into the crook of her knee or the small of her back, the wolves found their place around her and around the man, 7 of them altogether, laying like great furry hot water bottles on top of the 2. in keeping them warm all through the night, until Aoife awoke in the morning. And at first she expected to find herself alone, as if the whole thing had been a dream, a fever dream, a dream of someone in the very depths of despair. But no, the man was still there and still holding her, and the wolves were still nestled about her, keeping her warm with their thick fur. And she was afraid to move. But as the dawn light filtered its way through the branches of the woods, the man stirred and woke, and the wolves stirred and woke, and they yawned and lolled their tongues and wagged their tails and stretched and moved. And the man stood to his feet, still a great big bear of a man, and he helped Aoife to her feet and said, "I will walk you to the edge of the village, and there you must return to your life and promise me that you will not seek to end what you were given in any sense." And she didn't know what he meant, but perhaps the life that God had given her was not hers to end. And they walked slowly, the man, the woman, the 7 wolves, back to the edge of the village. Not so close that anyone might see them in the village, should they be up and about early, as farmers tend to be, but close enough that she could walk Aoife safely home to her house. And she turned to say farewell to him and said, I don't even know your name or who you are or how you come to be wandering through the woods with 7 wolves as docile to you as dogs were to my grandfather when he was alive." "Ah," said the man, "I am Fowler, and you will hear from me again before the end." And with that he and the wolves turned and walked, disappeared into the shadows of the trees. And Aoife walked home and told no one of her wish to kill herself the previous night, nor did she tell anyone of her encounter with the wolves or the strange man in the woods. And she went about her life. And she grew heavier and heavier with child. And there were those who said this must be the last child, the last gift to her from her late husband. She must have been pregnant and not even known it on the day she stood by his graveside and watched the coffin lowered into the earth. But Aoife was convinced that she had not been pregnant when she stood by her husband's grave. It had been some time since they'd last made love together. She didn't see how she could be. Nor had she been in any way touched or interfered with by that strange man in the woods, and yet pregnant she was, and she grew heavier and heavier, until at 7 months, by her reckoning, although it was 9 months by the reckoning of the villagers, since the death of her husband, she came to term. She gave birth to a beautiful daughter, a strangely quiet daughter, who didn't cry and wail the way other babies did, but was watchful, silent, strange. And Sinead grew up, the apple of her mother's eye. Although always a little ill-trusted by the other children, for she moved silently. Some said like a cat, although others might have said like a wolf, padding through the forests. 1 minute she would be off half a mile away, and the school kids, the children of the village, the school children would turn their backs, and when they looked back again, a second later, there she'd be by their side, with no hint of how she'd got there or sound of her approach, but there she was, and it was unnerving. And when, as sometimes happened, a howl would echo from the deep woods, whereas the rest of the villagers would cross themselves and say their prayers, Sinead would sit and she would listen. And she would say strange things. The deer are running to the west. The wolves are hunting to the east. The snows will be starting early this year, they say. And she would explain the howling of the wolf as if it were as clear as her own mother tongue. And of course, at first, everyone thought she was simply making things up, as children do. She was imagining things and telling strange tales, as children will. But when she said the deer were running to the east, it would be found that the deer were running to the east. When she said the wolves are hunting in the west, there indeed, the next day, the woodsman would find the remains of the wolves' kill in the east. When she said winter would come early this year, winter did indeed come early that year. Whatever it is that the wolves sang to her happened. And so gradually, the adults whose memories were longer and better than those of the children began to realise that maybe Sinead did have some strange power. Did they think she understood the language of the wolves? At first they did not. They thought perhaps it was the second sight. But there was that day when one of the villagers, Connery, was out herding his sheep, and a great wolf appeared, circling the sheep, snarling and growling. And Connery set up a cry for the villagers to come for help, and they all came rushing, including Sinead herself, who was 13, 14 at that point. And whilst the men were looking for pitchforks and axes and clubs and any manner of weapons they could lay hands to with which to kill the wolf, Sinead, who was small for her age, walked quietly, hardly anyone paying attention at first, up through the throng of women, up through the throng of men, up to the edge of the field, where the sheep were quaking and the wolf could be seen in the distance. And she threw back her head and she howled like a beast, and at once all of the villagers snapped their heads round and saw what was going on. And the women thought to themselves, surely she will be eaten now. Surely she will. But the wolf threw back its head and howled. And then it growled, and Sinead growled. And it was as if a conversation was taking place between child and beast. The men were rooted to the spot, the women were rooted to the spot, watching what was going on. And at length the wolf turned tail and disappeared off into the forests. And Sinead came back and said, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, the wolves are particularly hungry this year, for the winter is harsh coming, and their usual food has been driven off by one of the other villages, hunting to excess. I say to the wolves that if we leave out some small offerings for them, they will leave the sheep alone. And everyone at first thought she was quite insane. People began to mutter and talk of witchcraft. But Sinead had a strange force of personality about her. Although she was quiet, she didn't shout, she didn't snap, she didn't snarl, she was not given to sarcasm, but to state things plainly and simply, that this is what had to be done. And the farmer who owned those particular sheep, and who was grateful for whatever it was that she had done, that had sent the wolf packing and left his sheep unmolested, listened to her and thought about it at length, thought of the strange stories his own grandfather had told him when he was a child about the ways of the old people, and took Sinead's advice to heart. He went off hunting for hare, for rabbit, for any small prey he could find. And when he had gathered half a dozen, he placed them upon a boulder near to where he had seen that great wolf standing. And then retreated. And seeing Sinead walking down the country lane, he beckoned her over and told her what he had done, and she nodded and smiled and approved, and threw back her head and howled a long, slow ululation. And barely had the sound died upon the air when farmer and child saw padding down from out of the woods 2 wolves who came to the stone where the offering had been left, and they picked up a rabbit each, a hare each, and they returned. And then other wolves came and took the other offerings. And for the rest of that autumn and into the winter, not once was the farmer harassed by wolves, although other farmers in other villages they heard had been. And whenever anyone said that Sinead was a little too strange, perhaps a little too witchy for her own good, the farmer would leap to her defence and say, no, we should listen to what she has to say. This is the way the world was, my grandfather said, when he was young, that people would listen and they would work with all of the creatures of the world, not only the creatures of the farm, but the creatures of the woods and the creatures of the mountains. They would work with all and sundry as one large community, and we should go back to that, the farmer said. And time went on, and people would turn to her. When they heard wolves howling in the forest, they would ask Sinead what the wolves wanted, and Sinead would advise them, guide them. And there came occasions when a child would be lost in the forest. And no matter how high and low parents and uncles and aunts and neighbours and friends would look, the child would be nigh on impossible to find. Until someone remembered and asked Sinead, who would throw back her head and howl and cry like a beast of the forest. And as everyone stood a little afraid and a little shivering and a little shaking, they would hear the howls of the wolves echo back from the forest. And then Sinead would say, oh, he's over there, or she's over there. And off the parents, the aunts, the uncles, the grandparents would rush, and there would be the child unharmed in exactly the spot that the wolf girl had said, for that's how they came to refer to her by that point in time, the wolf girl. And as other young girls grew into womanhood, they would be romanced by the young men of the village, and they would choose the one that they liked most, and usually arrangements would be made and marriages would be had. But none of the young men of the village particularly wanted to court young Sinead, for though she was a kind woman, a gentlewoman, she was not amazingly good looking, but she was pleasant enough to behold. They were afraid of her, and they wondered what it would mean to marry the wolf girl. Would she have wolf children? What strange and magical things would go on? Would every full moon she'd bite a lump out of them? What stories grew and grew and grew as speculation went round and round as to quite what would be involved in such an arrangement. And so nobody quite dared to pay court to Sinead, and her mother, Eva, began to worry that if she were to become a spinster, what would happen to her in old age? She had no children to look after her when she was elderly, as Eva had her own daughter to look after her now. For there was no welfare state in those days. People had to look after themselves within their own families, and if they had no families, well, there was no one but the church charity to take care of them, and there is little enough warmth in that. And so Eva one day walked into the deep forest. She walked and she walked until she came to that great oak tree she thought was the one that she had tried to hang herself from all those years earlier. And she called out to the forest, "Fowler! Fowler!" And no voice came, no figure appeared, but the wind blew. And whether it was the branches of the oak itself or some other ancient tree, there was the creaking and the groaning that is the voice of trees. And Aoife felt as if perhaps that was acknowledgement, recognition, response. And she poured out her heart, her worries for her daughter, for what would befall her in the future if she were alone, unwed, childless, growing older and older, frailer and frailer, dependent upon parish charity. And would the man of the forest be able to advise, be able to help? She felt sure that Sinead was in some strange way, if not his daughter, at least his kin. Would he not help his kin? And the wind grew stronger and the creaking of tree branches grew stronger. And that was it. And so eventually Aoife, unsure if she had been understood, unsure if her request had been met with acceptance or rejection, returned home. And she said nothing to her daughter because her daughter was of that somewhat temperamental age when girls don't like to think their mother is interfering in their love life. And the next night, as they sat, the two of them, mother and daughter, into the evening by candlelight, repairing clothing, chatting, eating, there came a long, low, lonesome howl. And at once Sinead sat up and said, "Mother, we have visitor." She went to the door. And there, when she opened the doorway, was a long-limbed young man with strange eyes and the strange movements and gestures and tilt of the head that reminded Aoife so much of her own daughter. And she felt sure then that the man of the forest had heard her, and this was his answer. Sinead stepped aside and welcomed the young man in, and he came. And they sat in silence, for he had no words, at least not words in the human languages. But this young man and Sinead spoke to each other in a fashion, with gestures and tilts of the head and low throaty growls. And the mother sat and watched and wondered again what would become of her daughter, what would become of the future. In the wee small hours of the morning, the young man stood and made his way out of the house, disappeared into the night. And it was only then that Sinead explained to her mother that he was of the people of the forest, the wolf people, those who walk on all fours and sometimes, but only sometimes, upon two legs, the Conrocht, the wolf men, and that he wished to pay her court, that he was, in a sense, a distant cousin. and would become a regular visitor. Does he speak? Does he speak Irish? Does he speak the Gaelic? Her mother said. Not yet, not yet, said Sinead, but I think in time he will. And then Aoife fell to worrying about how the rest of the villagers would respond to a stranger coming amongst their midst, especially one who was perhaps slow with the language and strange in their mannerisms. They were nervous enough of her daughter, let alone of a complete stranger, a complete outsider. And even in the days ahead, as she worried, and every so often there would be a howl in the middle of the night and a tap at the door, and there he would be again. And occasionally Aoife might get a word of greeting or a word of farewell amongst all of the strange lupine gestures and conversations between this young man and her daughter. The neighbours began to notice, for they were not used to hearing howling so close within their village. And at first the rumours would go round that someone had put a head out of a door and seen a wolf skulking into or out of the village. And then someone would say that they had seen a young man, and then someone would say that they had seen a young man fall down upon all fours and run like a wolf, or a wolf stand up on two legs and walk like a man. And the rumours of the werewolves would go round and round and round, and Aoife would try to laugh it off and say, this is nonsense. There are no such things as werewolves. You must have been sleeping, you must have imagined it, or had too much ale and fantasised the thing. But it took very little to put two and two together and to think of the strange wolf girl who spoke the language of wolves, and now the presence of a wolf man within the village. And if they had been prepared to just about tolerate the oddity of a wolf girl within their village, the prospect of an outsider, a stranger, a thing that was not wholly human nor wholly wolf, and not in the least bit holy in any sense of the word, was too much. Far too much. Word began to go round that Aoife and her daughter were witches, were in league with the devil, should be brought before the priest. The old priest, well, he was nearly deaf and nearly blind, and although the village loved him, they knew he was near the end of his life, and there was word around that they should send off for a new priest, a young priest, write to the bishop, contact someone in authority, someone with passion and with strength who knew how to deal with these things, not someone who barely was aware of the world around them half the time. And Aoife knew how that one would end. What to do, she thought to herself, what to do. And there came the night, barely a month from the first visit, when the howl sounded in the hours of darkness, and the tap at the door, and there he was again, the young wolf man. But he'd barely spent 2-3 minutes inside the house when shouts and calls and cries came from the neighbours who had been watching and waiting for exactly this sort of thing to happen. And then came the lights of lanterns as people barged out their houses, armed with pitchforks and knives and axes and guns, who had come to confront this creature from another world, to confront these two women who would perhaps be better off sent into another world. And the yelling and the howling and the shouting and the pushing and the jostling. Well, this young man, and Aoife still did not have a name to even put to him. For as much as she'd asked, Sinead had said, he has no name that a human could pronounce. Oh, he was quick and fleet like a wolf. He was off snarling and snapping, his muzzle extending, his fur growing, his pelt thickening, the better that he should defend himself upon 4 legs than upon 2, as the neighbours kicked open doors and flashed blades and jeered and yelled. And the wolf bit, as wolves will when they're cornered. And Sinead snarled and she snapped, and though she could not produce a muzzle with fangs, she fought as viciously and bitterly as if she had them. And her mother too fought as best she could, although with fists flying and weapons flailing. Someone, intentionally, accidentally, who can say, caught Aoife heavily on the back of the head, and she fell to the ground like a stone. And then there were howls from outside. Howls from the darkness, from left and right, from east and north, and west and south. And the villagers screamed and howled and tore this way and that, the brave losing their bravery in the face of so much wildness and mayhem. And the young man and Sinead took to the night, and they ran and they ran and they ran, and they joined their brethren in the forest, and those few souls brave enough to chase after them soon lost sight of them in the dark. And Sinead was gone from the village. The young man was gone from the village, none to come back. And whilst the villagers were busy racing hither and yon, looking after their young and their old, and dreading what might happen next, Aoife lay bleeding out her last upon the floor of her own house. And as she opened her eyes for the last time, she saw standing over her a great tall figure who lowered himself and took her up in his arms and carried her dying body into the darkness, leaving behind only an empty house and a blood stain and a memory of the wolf people. Thank you.